A mob boss stands in front of his crew and makes a joke about Bumpy Johnson's dead brother. The room laughs. Bumpy hears about it that same night. Everyone who knows Harlem understands what's about to happen. Not when, but how much it will cost. Joke started in Little Italy, inside a cramped back room where cigar smoke hung thick and cards slapped against felt tables. 5 men sat under a single bulb, their collars loose, their laughter easy. Money changed hands. Whiskey poured. And then Sal Martino, a capo in the Genovese family, leaned back in his chair and said something he thought was funny. "You hear about Bumpy's brother?" Sal grinned, his gold tooth catching the light. "They say he got clipped trying to be a hero. Guess it don't run in the family." The table went quiet for half a second. Then one man chuckled. Another followed. Soon the whole room was laughing, not because the joke was good, but because Sal was the one who said it. That's how it works when you're connected. Your jokes land whether they're funny or not, but jokes don't stay in backrooms by midnight. A runner named Nico was walking out of that club with a pocket full of errand money and a head full of gossip. He stopped at a diner on Mulberry Street and told the story to a waitress who served coffee to half the neighborhood. She told her cousin, who ran numbers on the east side. He told a boxer who trained in Harlem. And by 2 a.m, the joke had crossed the invisible line that separated Little Italy from the streets Bumpy. Johnson controlled. It reached a barbershop first, the kind of place where men didn't just get haircuts, they got news. The barber, an older man named Cleveland, heard it from a porter who swept floors at a mob-owned social club. Cleveland didn't react. He just kept trimming, kept his razor steady, and when the customer left, he locked the door early. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. By dawn, the joke had made its way to a pool hall on Lenox Avenue. A man named Eddie, one of Bumpy's couriers, heard it from a kid selling newspapers on the corner. Eddie didn't laugh. He didn't curse. He just folded the paper under his arm, walked 3 blocks north, and knocked on the door of a brownstone where the lights were still on. Inside, Bumpy Johnson sat at a small table near the window, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. He wasn't a large man, but he filled the room in a way size never could. His suit was pressed. His tie was straight. His hands were folded and his eyes were calm. Eddie stood in the doorway and didn't sit down. "Something you need to hear," Eddie said. Bumpy looked up slowly, the kind of look that made men choose their next words carefully. Eddie told him. Every word, every detail. The backroom, the card game, Sal Martino's name. The joke itself. When Eddie finished, the room was silent. Bumpy didn't move. His expression didn't change. He lifted the coffee cup, took a slow sip, and set it down with the same control he'd had before the news arrived. His eyes stayed on the window, watching the street wake up under the early light. "Who else knows?" Bumpy asked. "Half of Harlem." "By now," Eddie said quietly. Bumpy nodded once, not in anger, not in surprise, just acknowledgement. "Go home," Bumpy said. "Get some sleep." Eddie hesitated. "You want me to go home?" Bumpy repeated, his voice even, almost gentle. Eddie left. Bumpy sat alone for another hour. He didn't make a phone call. He didn't send word. He just sat there, still as stone, while the city moved around him. People who didn't know him might have thought he was doing nothing. People who did know him understood he was doing everything. Because in Harlem, silence wasn't absence, it was presence. And when Bumpy Johnson went quiet, the streets paid attention. By mid-morning, the word had spread further. Not about what Bumpy would do, but about what everyone knew he would do. Shop owners on 125th Street started closing their shutters an hour early. Runners cleared their corners. Hustlers moved their dice games indoors. Nobody was told to. Nobody needed to be. Harlem had seen this before. not the specifics, but the shape of it. The way the air changed when someone crossed a line they shouldn't have. The way Bumpy's name moved through the neighborhood like a warning no one had to speak aloud. In Little Italy, Sal Martino woke up that same morning and went about his business. He collected his envelope from a bookie on Mott Street. He had lunch with two of his men at a restaurant where the owner knew to comp the wine. He laughed. He joked. He acted like a man who owned the world. But one of his lieutenants, a quieter man named Frankie, pulled him aside before dinner. "You hear anything?" Frankie asked. "About what?" "About what you said last night," Sal shrugged. "It was a joke, Frankie." "Relax." Frankie didn't relax. He'd been in the life long enough to know that some jokes cost more than others. But Sal wasn't listening. He waved Frankie off, lit a cigarette, and walked out into the street like nothing had changed, but something had. And by the time the sun set that evening, everyone from the Bronx to Brooklyn knew one thing for certain. Bumpy Johnson had heard the joke, and he hadn't said a word. Bumpy Johnson had a brother once, not the kind of brother you forgot about, not the kind whose name faded after the funeral. William Johnson, Willie to the family, Big Will to the streets, was the kind of man who shaped everything that came after him. He was older by 7 years, taller by 3 inches, and harder. In all the ways that mattered when you grew up black in the South and moved north, looking for something better than survival. Willie raised Bumpy. Their mother worked 2 jobs that paid like 1. Their father was gone before Bumpy could remember his face. So it was Willie who taught him how to tie a tie, how to read a room, how to carry himself like he belonged somewhere even when the world said he didn't. Willie didn't preach. He didn't lecture. He just showed Bumpy what it looked like to be a man who didn't bend. They moved to Harlem in 1930. When the neighborhood still had hope in it, Willie got work at a loading dock. Bumpy ran errands, shined shoes, did whatever paid. But even then, Willie had a reputation. He wasn't a gangster. He wasn't a hustler. He was something older than that something the neighborhood recognized and respected without needing a title for it. He was a protector. When the Irish boys from Hell's Kitchen came through looking to shake down black-owned businesses, Willie stood in the doorway of a grocery store on 8th Avenue and told them to keep walking. They didn't. Willie put 2 of them in the hospital and didn't get arrested because the entire block swore they saw nothing. When a landlord tried to evict a woman with 3 kids because she was 2 weeks late on rent, Willie went to the man's office and had a conversation. The eviction notice disappeared. The woman stayed. Willie never said what the conversation included, but the landlord never tried it again. That's who Willie was. He didn't need a gang. He didn't need a crew. He had the respect of people who lived right and the fear of people who didn't. And for a long time, that was enough. But respect doesn't stop bullets. It was 1935. Bumpy was 22. Still learning the game, still figuring out how power moved in a city that didn't give it to men who looked like him. Willie was 29 and still working the docks, still keeping the peace in a neighborhood that needed it. One night, 2 white cops showed up outside a tenement building on 130th Street. They were drunk, they were loud, and they were dragging a 14-year-old kid by the collar, accusing him of stealing something he didn't steal. The kid's mother was screaming. Neighbors were gathering. The cops didn't care. Willie was walking home from a late shift when he heard the commotion. Didn't run. He never ran. He walked up calm, hands visible, voice steady, and asked what the problem was. The cops told him to mind his business. Willie said the kid was his business. One of the cops shoved him. Willie didn't shove back. He just stood there, blocking the doorway, and told them they weren't taking the boy anywhere. The cop pulled his gun. Willie still didn't move. The second cop told his partner to put it away. There were too many witnesses, too many eyes. But the first cop was drunk. and angry and tired of being told what to do by a black man who wasn't scared. He fired. Once Willie went down in the street, blood spreading across the pavement while the kid ran and the crowd scattered, and the two cops got back in their car and drove away like nothing had happened. Bumpy found out an hour later he was at a card game in a basement off Lenox when someone burst through the door, breathless, saying Willie had been shot. Bumpy didn't ask questions. He didn't finish the hand. He just stood up and walked out into the night, moving through the streets like a man already deciding what came next. By the time he reached the hospital, Willie was gone. The doctor said he died on the way. The cops said it was self-defense. The department said there'd be an investigation. There never was. The two officers stayed on the force. One of them got promoted 6 months later. Bumpy didn't cry at the funeral. He didn't rage. He stood beside the casket in a black suit that Willie had bought him 2 years earlier, and he listened to people talk about his brother like he was a saint. And maybe he was. But Bumpy knew something else too. Willie had died because he believed the system would protect him if he played by the rules. Bumpy never made that mistake. After the funeral, Bumpy changed. Not loud, not fast. But anyone who knew him could see it. He stopped working corners. He stopped taking small jobs. He started learning from men who understood that power didn't come from being right, it came from being inevitable. He learned from Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of Harlem's numbers racket, who taught him that respect was currency. He learned from old-school hustlers who knew how to move weight without moving recklessly. And he learned from his own grief, which never turned into rage but hardened into something colder, something sharper. Bumpy built an empire on his brother's grave. Not for revenge, not for money, but because Willie had believed in something, and Bumpy wasn't going to let that belief die in a gutter with no justice and no memory. He made sure Harlem remembered. Every store Willie had protected, Bumpy protected. Every family Willie had helped, Bumpy helped. And every cop, every mobster, every hustler who thought they could roll through Harlem and take what they wanted, Bumpy made sure they understood that those days were over. Willie's name became a legend, and Bumpy's name became a warning. So when Sal Martino sat in a backroom in Little Italy and made a joke about Bumpy's dead brother, he wasn't just insulting a man. He was spitting on a legacy. He was disrespecting the memory of someone who died protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, and in Harlem, that was the kind of disrespect you didn't survive. Bumpy sat at his table that morning, staring out at the streets his brother had died for, and made a decision, not in anger, not in haste, but with the same calm, cold certainty that had carried him from Willie's funeral to the top of the underworld. Sal Martino had made his last joke. He just didn't know it yet. Harlem didn't need a memo. By noon, the entire neighborhood knew. Not because Bumpy said anything he never did, but because the streets had a language of their own. A language built on silences, glances, and the way certain people moved when trouble was coming. And everyone who spoke that language knew what was about to happen. The first sign came from the policy bankers. They were the backbone of Harlem's economy, running the numbers game that kept half the neighborhood fed. Usually they worked there, corners until dark, taking bets, paying out winners, keeping the money flowing. But that afternoon, they started packing up early. No announcement, no explanation. They just folded their slips, pocketed their cash, and disappeared into tenements and backrooms. When a policy banker closes shop before sundown, people notice. Second sign came from the bars, the spots on Lenox and 7th Avenue that normally stayed open until the cops made them close. Those places started turning people away by mid-afternoon. Bartenders wiped down counters that were already clean. Managers flipped signs to closed and locked doors while customers were still asking for one more round. A few regulars tried to argue. Most didn't bother. They knew better. If the bars were closing, something serious was moving. By 3 o'clock, 125th Street looked like a Sunday morning in a neighborhood that didn't do church. The shoeshine boys were gone. The street vendors had packed up their carts. Even the hustlers who worked the alleys, man who'd sell you anything from a watch to a rumor, had vanished like smoke. The only people left on the corners were the ones who had to be there. And even they weren't talking. An old woman named Claudette sat on her stoop, shelling peas into a bowl, watching the street empty out around her. She'd lived in Harlem for 40 years. She'd seen the riots. She'd seen the raids. She'd seen the neighborhood burn and rebuild itself more times than she cared to count. But this quiet was different. It wasn't fear. Fear made people loud, made them panic, made them run in every direction looking for safety. This was respect. The kind of respect you gave a storm when you saw it coming. You didn't fight it. You didn't question it. You just got inside, closed the shutters, and waited for it to pass. Claudette looked up when her neighbor, a younger man named Jerome, walked past carrying a bag of groceries. "You here?" she asked. Jerome stopped, shifted the bag to his other hip, and nodded. "Heard. What they saying?" "They ain't saying nothing," Jerome replied. "That's how you know it's real." Claudette nodded and went back to her peas. Jerome kept walking. Neither of them said Bumpy's name. They didn't need to. Across town, in a pool room basement off 132nd Street, 3 men sat around a table that hadn't seen a game all day. One of them, a wiry guy named Louis, kept glancing at the stairs, like he expected someone to come down. The other 2 just sat in silence, smoking cigarettes, waiting. "You think he already moved?" Louis asked. The older man, a gray-haired hustler named Pitch, didn't look up. "If he moved, we'd know." "How?" "Because we wouldn't be sitting here." Louis didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. When Bumpy moved, the whole city felt it. And right now, the city was holding its breath. "Sal's got people," Louis said, "more to himself than anyone else. He's connected. He's got the Italians behind him." Pitch finally looked up, his expression flat. "You think that matters?" Louis didn't answer. "Connections don't mean nothing when you disrespect the dead," Pitch continued, his voice low and certain. Sal crossed a line. "Bumpy don't care who's backing him. He cares about one thing." "What's that?" "Legacy." The word hung in the air like something you could touch. Louis looked down at his hands and didn't say anything else. Uptown, in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, a woman named Nadine was putting her 2 kids to bed early. They complained. They weren't tired. It wasn't even dark yet. But Nadine didn't argue with them. She just tucked them in, kissed their foreheads, and told them to stay in their room no matter what they heard. Her husband, Marcus, stood in the kitchen, staring out the window at the empty street below. "You think it's tonight?" Nadine asked. From the doorway. Marcus didn't turn around. "Don't know. Could be tonight, could be next week, could be a month from now, but it's coming." "Yeah," Marcus said quietly. "It's coming." Nadine wrapped her arms around herself, even though the apartment was warm. Willie was a good man. He was. Bumpy loved him. Still does. Nadine nodded and went back to the bedroom. Marcus stayed at the window, watching the shadows stretch across the pavement as the sun began to set. Down in Little Italy, life went on as usual. Sal Martino sat at his favorite table in a restaurant on Mulberry Street, eating veal and drinking wine like a man who had nothing to worry about. His crew was with him, 4 men who laughed at his jokes and lit his cigarettes and acted like the world belonged to them. But Frankie, Sal's lieutenant, wasn't eating. He sat at the edge of the table, eyes on the door, jaw tight. "You're making me nervous," Sal said, waving a fork at him. "Relax," You should take this serious, Frankie said. Take what serious? A joke? It wasn't just a joke, Sal. Sal leaned back in his chair, smiling. You scared of some Harlem hustler? Frankie didn't smile back. I'm scared of the man who runs Harlem. There's a difference. Sal laughed and poured himself more wine. Let him come. We'll handle it. But Frankie didn't look convinced. He'd been in the life long enough to know when someone made a mistake. And Sal had made one. A big one. Back in Harlem, the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across empty corners. The neighborhood had buttoned itself up tight, like a house preparing for a hurricane. Doors were locked. Curtains were drawn. The music that usually spilled out of apartments and bars was turned down low or turned off completely. And somewhere in the middle of it all, in a brownstone with the lights still on, Bumpy Johnson sat at his table and made a phone call. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't give orders. He just said a name, a place, and a time. Then he hung up. And Harlem, still watching, still waiting, knew the storm had finally started to move. The phone call came at 8 in the morning. Sal Martino was still in bed when his lieutenant Frankie knocked on the door of his apartment in Little Italy. Sal groaned, pulled on a robe, and opened the door to find Frankie standing there with a look on his face that said this wasn't a social visit. What? Sal muttered, rubbing sleep from his eyes. You got a message, Frankie said. From who? Bumpy Johnson. Sal stopped rubbing his eyes. He stared at Frankie for a long moment, then laughed short and sharp, like he'd just heard the punchline to a joke he didn't think was funny. You're kidding. I'm not. Sal stepped back and let Frankie inside. The apartment was small but expensive. The kind of place a man bought when he wanted people to know he had money, but didn't want to look like he was showing off. Sal closed the door and leaned against it, arms crossed. What's the message? Frankie pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and handed it over. Sal opened it and read. The handwriting was clean, almost elegant. No threats. No profanity. Just a few lines that said everything without saying anything at all. Mr. Martino, I'd like to speak with you. Tomorrow evening. 7 o'clock. Rouse on 114th Street. Just the two of us. No need for trouble. Respectfully, Bumpy Johnson. Sal read it twice, then looked up at Frankie. Rouse? That's East Harlem. Neutral ground, Frankie said. It's Italian-owned, but it's close enough to his territory that he's comfortable. Sal folded the paper and tossed it onto a side table. He's inviting me to a sit-down. Looks like it. Because of the joke, Frankie didn't answer. He didn't need to. Sal walked to the window and looked out at the street below. Vendors were setting up. Delivery trucks were idling. The neighborhood was waking up, business as usual. But Sal's mind was somewhere else now, running through possibilities. He wants to talk, Sal said, more to himself and to Frankie. That means he's not coming at me with guns blazing. He wants to negotiate. Or he wants you in a room, Frankie said quietly. Sal turned around. You think it's a setup? I think it's Bumpy Johnson. And I think you made a joke about his dead brother. So yeah, Sal, I think you should be careful. Sal walked over to the table, picked up the note again, and stared at it. His first instinct was to ignore it, to send word back that he didn't take meetings with Harlem hustlers. But that would be a move, and moves had consequences. If he refused, Bumpy might see it as fear. Or worse, disrespect. And if there was one thing Sal understood, it was that disrespect demanded a response. I'll go, Sal said. Frankie's jaw tightened. That's a mistake. Why? You think he's going to clip me in the middle of Ruyao's, in front of witnesses? I think he's smarter than that, Frankie said, and I think you're underestimating him. Sal smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm not underestimating anybody. I'm going because if I don't, I look weak. And if I look weak, every two-bit hustler from here to the Bronx is gonna think they can step to me. Frankie didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, like a man who'd already accepted what was coming. You want me there? Frankie asked. No, Sal said. He said, just the two of us. I'll play it his way. Then take a gun. Sal looked at him. You think I'm stupid? Frankie didn't answer. The next evening, Sal dressed carefully. He wore a dark suit, pressed and tailored, with a white shirt and a thin tie. He shaved. He polished his shoes. He looked like a man going to a business meeting, which in a way, he was. But he also looked like a man who wanted to remind everyone in the room that he had power. Before he left, he checked the .38 snub-nose revolver he kept in a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. 5 rounds. Close range. Enough. Frankie drove him to East Harlem in a black Cadillac, neither of them speaking much. The streets changed as they crossed into territory that wasn't quite Italian anymore, but wasn't fully Bumpy's either. It was a border zone, the kind of place where both sides did business and both sides pretended to get along. Rouse sat on a corner, small and unassuming from the outside. It was the kind of restaurant where you didn't get a table unless you knew someone. The kind of place where deals were made over pasta and wine, and nobody ever called the cops. Frankie pulled up to the curb and put the car in park. I'll wait, Frankie said. No, Sal replied. Go back. I'll call when I'm done. Frankie looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just watched as Sal got out, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the door. Inside, the restaurant was dim and warm, the air thick with the smell of garlic and red sauce. A few tables were occupied, but not many. An older man in an apron, the owner, probably looked up when Sal entered. Martino? The man asked. Sal nodded. The owner gestured toward the back. He's waiting. Sal walked through the narrow space between tables, past a couple eating in silence, past a waiter folding napkins, until he reached a doorway that led to a private room. He paused, took a breath, and stepped inside. Bumpy Johnson sat alone at a small round table. He wasn't what Sal expected. There were no bodyguards, no enforcers standing in the corners. Just Bumpy, dressed in a gray suit, hands folded on the table, expression calm. A bottle of wine sat between two glasses, neither of them poured yet. Bumpy looked up and met Sal's eyes. Mr. Martino, Bumpy said, his voice quiet and even. Thank you for coming. Sal stepped further into the room and closed the door behind him. He didn't sit, not yet. You wanted to talk, Sal said. I did. So talk. Bumpy gestured to the chair across from him. Sit, please. Sal hesitated, then pulled the chair out and sat down. He kept his coat on, kept his hand within reach of the gun under his arm. Bumpy poured 2 glasses of wine, slow and deliberate, and slid one across the table. Sal didn't touch it. I'm not here to waste your time, Bumpy said, leaning back in his chair. And I'm not here to start a war. Then why am I here? Bumpy's expression didn't change. Because you said something. And I need to know if you understand what you said. Sal felt his jaw tighten. It was a joke. Was it? Yeah, a joke. Between me and my guys. I didn't know it was going to travel. Everything travels, Bumpy said quietly. You know that. Sal leaned forward, keeping his voice low. Look, if I offended you, fine, I apologize. But you didn't need to drag me out here for that. Bumpy didn't respond right away. He just looked at Sal, his eyes steady, unblinking. And in that silence, Sal felt something shift in the room, something cold. My brother's name was Willie, Bumpy said, his voice soft but heavy. He raised me, taught me everything I know. And he died in the street because 2 cops decided his life didn't matter. Sal said nothing. He died protecting a kid who didn't do nothing wrong, Bumpy continued. And when he died, nobody got arrested. Nobody got charged. The system didn't care. So I made sure the streets did. Bumpy picked up his glass and took a slow sip of wine. Then set it down with the same control he'd had from the start. You made a joke about him, Bumpy said. In front of your crew, and now the whole city knows. Sal's hand moved an inch closer to his coat. I said I'm sorry. I know, Bumpy replied. But sorry don't fix what's broken. Sal's heart was beating. Faster now, but he kept his face neutral. So what do you want? Bumpy leaned forward just slightly, his voice dropping even lower. I want you to understand something, Mr. Martino. My brother's memory is all I got left of him. And when you disrespect that, you disrespect everything he stood for, everything I built, everything Harlem believes in. Sal's mouth went dry. So? Here's what's gonna happen, Bumpy said, his tone calm, almost gentle. You're gonna leave this room. You're gonna go back to Little Italy, and you're never gonna speak his name again. Sal stared at him. That's it? Bumpy didn't blink. That's it. For a moment, Sal thought about reaching for the gun. Thought about ending this before it became something worse. But something in Bumpy's eyes stopped him. Not fear. Not threats. Certainty. Sal stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. We're done? Sal asked. Bumpy nodded. We're done. Sal turned and walked toward the door. But just as his hand touched the handle, Bumpy spoke again. Mr. Martino. Sal stopped but didn't turn around. If I hear my brother's name in your mouth again, Bumpy said quietly, you won't get another invitation. Sal opened the door and walked out. He didn't look back. Sal Martino didn't go back to Little Italy. He should have. He should have gotten in Frankie's car, driven straight home, poured himself a drink, and forgotten the whole thing ever happened. That's what a smart man would have done. That's what a man who understood the weight of the conversation he just had would have done, but Sal wasn't thinking clearly anymore. He walked out of, roused with his pride bruised and his ego bleeding, and instead of going home, he went to a bar 3 blocks away. A place called Ginny's, where the bartender knew him and the regulars didn't ask questions. He ordered whiskey, then he ordered another. And by the third glass, the fear that had crept into his chest during the meeting with Bumpy was turning into something else. Anger. Who the hell did Bumpy Johnson think he was? Sal was a made man. He was connected. He had the backing of one of the 5 families. And Bumpy was just a hustler from Harlem who'd gotten lucky. A black man playing a white man's game and thinking he could make the rules. The more Sal drank, the more convinced he became that he'd made a mistake, not the joke. The meeting. He shouldn't have gone. He shouldn't have sat there and listened to Bumpy lecture him like he was some kind of schoolboy who'd said something out of turn. He should have sent word back that Sal Martino didn't take orders from anyone, especially not someone who ran numbers and protection rackets in a neighborhood that didn't matter. By midnight, Sal was talking, not loud, not reckless, but enough. He told the bartender the meeting was a waste of time. He told one of the regulars that Bumpy had tried to scare him and it didn't work. And when a younger guy at the end of the bar asked what Bumpy had said, Sal leaned in and repeated the whole thing, including the part about Willie. His dead brother, Sal said, his words slurring just slightly. Guy acts like I killed him myself. It was a joke, that's all it was. The bartender, an older man named Gino, stopped wiping down glasses and looked at Sal with something close to concern. Maybe you should head home, Sal, Gino said quietly. I'm fine, Sal shot back, waving him off, but he wasn't fine, and 20 minutes later when 2 men walked into Ginny's and stood just inside the doorway, Sal knew it. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. One of them was tall and broad, with a scar running along his jaw. The other was smaller, wiry, with eyes that didn't blink. They just stood there, blocking the exit, and the entire bar went silent. Sal's hand instinctively moved toward his coat, toward the gun he'd been carrying all night. But before he could reach it, the taller man shook his head slow, deliberate, like a teacher correcting a student. "Don't," the man said. Sal froze. Smaller man walked forward, his footsteps the only sound in the room. He stopped in front of Sal, looked him over like he was inspecting a piece of furniture, then spoke in a voice that was almost polite. Mr. Johnson would like to finish the conversation. Sal's throat went dry. "We already talked." "No," the man said. "You talked. Now he wants you to listen." Sal glanced toward the bartender, toward the regulars, toward anyone who might step in. But no one moved. Gino had his eyes on the floor. The regular at the end of the bar was suddenly very interested. In his drink? Even the younger guy who'd been asking questions had disappeared into the back. Sal was alone. "Let's go," the smaller man said, gesturing toward the door. Sal thought about running, thought about fighting, thought about pulling the gun and taking his chances, but his body wouldn't move. His hands were shaking, and somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the whiskey and the anger and the pride, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. He stood up slowly and followed the two men out into the street. A black car was waiting at the curb, engine running. The taller man opened the back door. Sal hesitated, then climbed in. The smaller man got in beside him. The taller man got in the front, and the car pulled away from the curb, smooth and silent, heading north toward Harlem. No one spoke. Sal's mind was racing, running through every possible outcome, every story he'd heard about men who got into cars and never got out. He thought about Frankie's warning. He thought about the gun under his jacket that he couldn't reach. He thought about the joke he'd made in a back room that now felt like it had happened a lifetime ago. The car stopped in front of an abandoned warehouse on the edge of Harlem, the kind of place where nobody came unless they had business that couldn't be seen. The taller man got out first, opened Sal's door, and gestured for him to follow. Sal's legs felt like lead, but he moved. Inside, the warehouse was dark except for a single light hanging in the center of the room. And beneath that light, sitting in a chair with his hands folded and his expression calm, was Bumpy Johnson. Sal was pushed forward, not rough but firm, until he stood 10 feet away from Bumpy. The two men who'd brought him stayed behind, silent shadows in the dark. Bumpy looked up. "You didn't listen," Bumpy said. Sal's voice cracked when he tried to speak. I didn't say anything." "You did," Bumpy replied, his tone as calm as it had been at Rosa's. "You went to a bar. You had a few drinks, and you talked. You told people. I tried to scare you. You told them the meeting didn't matter. And you said my brother's name again." Sal's knees almost buckled. "I didn't mean. You did," Bumpy interrupted. "You meant every word. Because you don't think I'm serious. You think because you're connected, because you got the Italians behind you, that you're untouchable." Bumpy stood up slowly, his movements controlled, deliberate. He walked toward Sal, stopping just a few feet away. "Let me tell you something about my brother," Bumpy said, his voice low and steady. "Willie didn't care about power. He didn't care about money. He cared about people, about protecting them, about making sure they had a chance to live with dignity." Bumpy's eyes never left Sal's, and when he died, I made a promise that no one, no cop, no gangster, no man with a badge or a gun or a family behind him would ever disrespect this neighborhood again, not without paying for it. Sal tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "You disrespected my brother," Bumpy said. "You disrespected me. And you disrespected every person in Harlem who believes that some things are sacred." Bumpy stepped back, nodded once to the men in the shadows. Sal never saw them move. He felt the hands on his shoulders first, strong and unyielding, forcing him to his knees. He tried to fight, tried to scream, but a hand clamped over his mouth, and the sound died in his throat. Bumpy crouched down in front of him, his face inches away. "This is the lesson," Bumpy said quietly. "Respect isn't about fear, it's about understanding, and you never understood." Sal's eyes were wide, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking. Bumpy stood up, turned his back, and walked toward the door. "Make sure he understands now," Bumpy said to the men behind him, and then he was gone. The warehouse door closed. And Sal Martino learned what it meant to cross a line. You couldn't come back from. Sal Martino disappeared on a Tuesday night. By Wednesday morning, his crew knew something was wrong. Frankie went to Sal's apartment and found the door locked, the lights off, no sign of him. He called the bar. He called the social clubs. He called every number he had. Nothing. By Thursday, the word was out. Sal was gone. Not missing. Not hiding. Gone in the way men go when they're never coming back. Nobody turned up in the river. No anonymous tip led cops to a shallow grave in the woods. There was just absence, clean, complete, and impossible to ignore. Frankie sat in the back of a car with two other made men, all of them staring at each other, waiting for someone to say what they were all thinking. "We gotta talk to the family." One of them finally said. Frankie shook his head. "And say what? That Sal ran his mouth and got clipped by a black gangster from Harlem? You think they're gonna go to war over that?" The other man didn't answer. "They'll ask questions," Frankie continued. "And when they find out what Sal said, when they hear about the joke, they'll wash their hands of it. Because nobody wants to start a war over a man who didn't know when to shut up." The silence in the car said everything. By Friday, the story had spread through every neighborhood in New York. Not the details. Nobody knew the details, but the shape of it. Sal Martino had disrespected Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy had given him a warning. Sal hadn't listened. And now Sal was gone. The Italian crews didn't retaliate. They didn't send soldiers into Harlem. They didn't put a bounty on Bumpy's head. They just absorbed the loss, the way organizations do when a man makes a mistake that costs more than he's worth. Sal had been a capo, but he wasn't untouchable. And in the world they lived in, disrespecting the dead was a sin that transcended loyalty. The cops didn't investigate. A detective named Halloran, who'd been on the organized crime beat for 15 years, heard about Sal's disappearance and made a note in a file that would never be opened. He knew better than to dig into something that had Bumpy Johnson's fingerprints on it, not because he was scared, but because he understood how the city worked. Some bodies weren't meant to be found, some cases weren't meant to be solved, and some men, when they crossed certain lines, simply stopped existing. By the following week, Harlem had returned to normal. The policy bankers were back on their corners. The bars reopened. The street vendors returned to 125th Street, selling everything, from fruit to bootleg records. The neighborhood exhaled, the tension that had gripped it for days finally releasing. Bumpy Johnson was seen around town, same as always. He walked into the barber shop on Lenox and got a shave. He stopped by a diner and had coffee with an old friend. He sat in the back of a jazz club and listened to Billie Holiday sing like the world wasn't full of blood and consequence. People nodded when he passed. Some said his name, others just lowered their eyes in respect. But no one asked him about Sal Martino. No one mentioned the warehouse. No one needed to. The message had been delivered, and Harlem, every hustler, every shop owner, every cop on the beat understood it perfectly. You could challenge Bumpy's territory. You could test his patience. You could even try to take what was his, but you could never, ever disrespect the dead. Because the dead were the foundation. The dead were the reason men like Bumpy existed in the first place. Willie Johnson had died protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves, and Bumpy had built an empire to make sure that sacrifice meant something. One evening, a few weeks after Sal disappeared, Bumpy stood on the corner of 135th and Lenox, watching the sun set over the rooftops. The streets were alive with sound kids playing stickball, women calling down from fire escapes, men laughing outside a pool hall. This was what Willie had died for. Not power, not money, not revenge. This. The neighborhood, the people, the belief that they deserved to live without fear, without being stepped on, without being disrespected by men who thought they were untouchable. Bumpy lit a cigarette and watched the smoke drift into the evening air. Somewhere in Little Italy, the Italians were probably still trying to figure out what happened to Sal. They'd never find him. They'd never know the details. And eventually, they'd stop asking, because in the end, the only thing that mattered was the lesson. And the lesson was simple. Some men protected their territory. Some men protected their money. But Bumpy Johnson protected something bigger than both. He protected memory. He protected legacy. And he made sure that anyone who tried to take that away paid a price that couldn't be calculated in dollars or bullets. Sal Martino had learned that lesson too late. But everyone else, every mobster, every hustler, every man who thought he could talk reckless and walk away clean, they learned it just in time. Bumpy finished his cigarette, dropped it on the pavement, and crushed it under his heel. Then he turned and walked back into Harlem, disappearing into the neighborhood that had made him, the neighborhood he'd sworn to protect, the neighborhood that would remember his name long after he was gone, because legends aren't built on violence. They're built on principle. And Bumpy Johnson's principle was carved in stone. Respect the living, honor the dead, and never, ever forget